wait a couple minutes. I mean, do you have a computer with this on it right now?
Yeah.
Do you want to try to do that? And you know what? Worst case, we could just leave it on this screen. Worst case, just scroll through them this way.
Yeah. I mean, we can just zoom in. So then this is super smart. Can you do this in it, or no? Yeah, we can also do it that way.
Oh my gosh, I don't understand.
I'm gonna jump.
No. You're not gonna let me jump? I wasn't even jumping over it.
I was kidding. Jump more than about 6 inches.
I think that was the max I did jump in high school.
I don't understand.
Okay. That's hilarious.
Oh my god, I'm really sorry. I don't know.
No, it's okay.
You know any tricks for PowerPoint?
What's the problem? Yeah, see, mine's not doing it. I think we should just switch to a computer.
Okay. And is this a Mac or a PC?
Yeah,
do you have
it's
an
a Mac,
HD
but I have the, yep.
Okay.
Okay.
So when it's your turn to, when you guys come up, we'll just switch to your computer.
Okay. Is it not working?
There's something about the timing on this PDF that's going crazy. Let me make sure that. Okay, I'm gonna reopen these real quick. What's happening? Do you see that?
Yeah, that's what it was doing before.
It just scrolled through all of them and I don't know why. Yeah. Is it something to do with the mouse?
Because that's what it was doing before, but it didn't without the mouse.
And then we got it to stop.
Yeah.
It's my computer. There's something with my computer. Why did that happen? It wasn't happening. It didn't happen this morning with any of them.
After we did it the first time. If you exit out, I don't know.
I just closed PowerPoint and reopened it.
That's weird.
I don't know what to do.
So you click on the first slide and it
On the first slide,
okay, it's there.
from beginning. I wonder if there maybe unplug this. Yeah, that'll make any difference.
There's something.
And like I can. What is it doing? It's even doing that in this though. Like I feel like there's
Like a button activated.
I don't know. Damn it. And of course all these files are here on this computer.
So what if they did? I mean, it wouldn't. It's not that bad if they just like scroll from picture to picture. Will it let them?
Well, right, but that's when like I'm not
Even in this mode, like where you just click each slide and then go to the next one.
Yes. But then it's like as soon as I click in this window, I don't want Carl to have to go through and do this, you know? Like I don't know what's going on. Custom slideshow. See,
That's what it was doing.
Button on my computer that's messed up.
Yeah.
Maybe we should just restart the computer.
Try that really fast. Yeah.
Alright. I don't want to do this, but like I don't. I turned the mouse off. I mean, nothing's.
Well, now it's stopped. Maybe that'll help.
Like all the buttons are functioning normally. I don't know what it would be that's.
Yeah, because see, that's what it did when I was talking, and it just switched. That's what it did, and that's why I was like, it just did.
I remember the slide had switched, but
didn't
it just
get it.
went to the next slide, and that was it because you didn't have one more slide. But then it was fine for all the
And then as soon as we exited multiple times, we got into it. But it did the exact same thing where it was flashing. So I don't know if something's getting stuck. Maybe this will work because your mouse stopped shaking right when you lifted the computer up.
I just don't want it to happen to anybody else.
What if we say technology is supposed to make life so much easier, and usually it makes everything so much more complicated. Is this your working computer?
I don't even have a personal computer.
I do, but it's so bad that I just use everything in my work computer.
Right.
And I have all these security settings, so there's only certain things that I can do.
Okay, so luckily I have it all on my desktop.
Let's try that one again.
All right, so. Okay.
See? Alright. So anytime that mouse starts doing something weird, it's
But I don't know how to fix it is the problem. If it does it again, I don't know what we're gonna do. Okay. Of course, I restarted my computer, so now it's trying to open up all my apps, and now I have to wait and turn all the apps off. What?
you don't want people to get online.
No, I just had to restart my computer. I'm just hoping no other apps pop up that I have to close, like what happened earlier. I think it's fine. There's like a lot less people here than there was earlier.
Yeah, we always lose the power of Or there might be some stragglers.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I think I got it. Okay. Just started when it's time. Okay. Like flashlights.
I can do it.
Or whoever's out there into here.
Yeah.
Are we live already? What? Are we live already?
Yeah, you're live. So we're good to go whenever.
You're just gonna wait for people to come in. We're already 10 minutes past. Alright. Okay, hope everybody had a nice lunch. Now it's doing it again.
Is it doing it again?
Do you know?
Check.
Do you understand what might be?
No, I don't.
Okay.
And the reason why is I don't.
All we're gonna touch is the buttons.
Okay. Alright, try that.
Good? Yeah. Okay, I think we've got the technical issues figured out, hopefully. So our next presenter is supposed to be Beth O'Leary. She's going to come up from Las Cruces and give us a presentation. Unfortunately, she and her husband were both sick this week and were unable to make the drive up. So, is this better? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Our next presenter is Beth O'Leary. She was supposed to come up from Las Cruces and present for us today, but she and her husband were both sick this week, so unfortunately she wasn't able to come up. But Carl Lumba has been gracious enough to offer to give Beth's presentation for us. So you get a double dose of Carl.
Thank you, Megan. Well, this is a powerful story. I read it this morning and my hanky's wet, and I may get emotional, but I'll try not to. It's getting harder as I get older. But this being slide one, I hope. Thank you for inviting me, Beth O'Leary, to talk about a man, Clarence Fielder, that Beth was privileged to work with, and a place that is very significant in the history of Las Cruces. The title of her talk, Farther Along, is from the gospel hymn, which was the theme song for the project. It took a long time to restore the church, and this song helped us keep going. Here's the chorus. Farther along, we'll know all about it. Farther along, we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brother. Live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. Her talk is also about being farther along, because we're not there yet. This is a story about before and after. We all love before and after. A mousy, dowdy woman has a makeover and suddenly looks like Beyonce. On the left is the chapel in 2009, broken down and sad. On the right is the chapel in 2014, restored. In the middle is the man, Mr. Clarence Fielder, the teacher, historian, and historic preservationist who inspired this restoration. So the talk is about transformation in the form of preservation and the inspiration provided by Mr. Fielder, who had an amazing life and legacy. He made the completion of the church a reality over the 5 long years that we worked on the project. All politics are local, all preservation is local. I borrow a quote from former Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill, all politics is local. I believe that all preservation is local. The preservation of Phillips Chapel stands out as one of the earliest efforts in the restoration and preservation of a significant place in the history of African Americans in New Mexico history. It has an iconic legacy as part of the movement of African Americans into the West and the role of segregation in the public school system. The reason for its success is the involvement of both Mr. Fielder and the community of Las Cruces. Without the community coming together around the church, the efforts to spearhead The effort spearheaded by an extraordinary man born in Las Cruces who dedicated his life to teaching students in the Las Cruces public schools and NMSU, the church would not be standing today. What is the past? We all have a past, and our past is full of places and stuff. I want to focus on the cultural resources, or broadly everything we have made as humans, including the places we lived and the traditions we have passed down to the next and future generations. The artifacts, features, and narratives we have as humans are broad and complex. Some examples here include the photo on the upper left of Geronimo and the U.S. Army Apache Scouts, who were all made prisoners of war and shipped to prison in St. Augustine, Florida. It includes on the lower left one of footprints made by Apollo 11 astronauts on the moon in 1969. In the center is the Rio Grande Theater in downtown Las Cruces, one of the first movie theaters in New Mexico, built in 1926. On the right, 1,000-year-old rock art from the Jornado-Mogollon region on NMSU's College Ranch. And the top center image of First Nations elder Marge Jackson, Chooska, using a CGS map to describe her travels as a child in the Yukon Territory of Canada. The formal movement of preservation began in the U.S. by trying to save what we considered nationally significant places. It is biased toward the East and the colonial legacy of leaders like Washington and Jefferson. It focused on the achievement of great men and usually neglected their relationship to other groups who participated in their achievements. For example, the extraordinary gardens at Jefferson's Monticello were made by the backbreaking work of slaves whose lives and dwellings were not investigated until recently. Many preservation efforts have celebrated stories of national identity, but have largely neglected places associated with the minoritized groups, including Native American, Latino, female, African American, and other non-white communities. Everyone has a significant past that should be acknowledged, celebrated, and preserved. To a great degree, all places have a contested past that should be made known in all our preservation efforts. Federal, state, and local law, ordinance, and regulation creates ways to list, evaluate, and help protect important places. Although the second largest city in New Mexico, it is only in 2019 that Las Cruces passed its first historic preservation ordinance. Preservation should be accessible to all people who want to keep their past visible and available today and in the future. Unfortunately, less than 8% of the sites on the National Register of Historic Places are associated with minoritized groups. Another example of bias, Tara Roberts, a black marine archaeologist who writes that over the course of 300 years and 36,000 voyages brought 12.5 million Africans to the Americas. Researchers estimate that as many as 1,000 of those ships wrecked, but to date, only 20 of them have been found and documented. In 2003, working with Mr. Fielder, then anthropology graduate student Terry Moody successfully listed Phillips Chapel on both the state and national register. Rita Padrell, director of the New Mexico African American Museum and Cultural Center, who will speak here today, would call the chapel as a place that was vital and should be made visible. It was known to those who worshiped and learned there and is significant to African American heritage, but until 2003, it was not known in the context of both New Mexico and national history. Mr. Fielder was teaching African American history in 2002 at NMSU, and he told Terry Moody about Phillips Chapel when she chose the building to write a nomination for as part of a graduate paper. They also received a grant from the New Mexico Endowment for the Humanities to prepare a traveling exhibit on the history of the Las Cruces community. In this talk, Beth relies on the research Clarence and Terry did for those projects. Terry Moody's research is still ongoing. All National Register properties require a description of the historic context. African Americans moved into New Mexico from the South, especially Texas, after the Civil War. There was a black diaspora both into the North and West with the end of slavery, and that continued under Jim Crow state and local policies. The Homestead Act created the opportunity to gain 160 acres for farming and ranching. In Las Cruces, many businesses were created by African Americans after the railroad was built. Clarence Fielder was born in 1928 in Las Cruces. He was the maternal grandson of Ollie and Daniel Hibbler. Mr. Fielder's great-grandparents were born into slavery in Mississippi and Kentucky. Clarence's maternal grandmother, Ollie, was born in 1876 in Texas. Her husband Daniel was a porter on the railroad in Raton, New Mexico, and was asked to become a cook at the Don Bernardo Hotel in Las Cruces. Ollie told Daniel she would marry him on the condition that they bring their minister from the Phillips CME Church. At that time it was the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, later called the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, and they started the first church in their home. In 1911, they purchased the land on which Phillips Chapel was built for $45 and had it deeded to the larger Diocese of Phillips CME. It was built by local workers who worked in adobe and plaster in the style of most New Mexico Catholic chapels or capillas, with buttresses on the entrance of the west facade. It is all adobe with a framed stucco bathroom added to the south side in the 1990s. Phillips Chapel is a sacred place. People were married, baptized, and funeral services were held there. It had a Sunday school and held various events including plays, concerts, and hobo parties. It is the oldest extant African American church in New Mexico. In 1925, the role of Phillips Chapel changed. It expanded to become a school for black children. Mr. Fielder's sister went to the door of Central Elementary School in Las Cruces, where all the children went from the neighborhood, and was told she could no longer go there. She was told to go to the colored church. Phillips Chapel was now a school. The New Mexico legislature passed a local option law for county school boards, and Las Cruces School Board voted to segregate. 8 other districts segregated, all in the south and the east of the Rio Grande. The school was supposed to be as good as and as well kept as those used by the pupils of Caucasian or other descent. But it was not separate and equal. What had been an unsegregated school system stayed segregated from 1925 to 1954. Clarabelle Williams was the first black teacher hired to teach at Phillips Chapel. All grades, 1 through 12, were initially taught there. 2 tar paper shacks were later put up near the chapel and became Lincoln High School until Booker T. Washington School was built in 1934. However, graduation and baccalaureate services were always held at the chapel. Mr. Fielder's aunt, Rosalie Hibbler, graduated in 1934, as well as many relatives of some African American families still in Las Cruces, including the Fielder, Pettis, and Billingsley families. As well as being a school, Phillips Chapel continued to have a vigorous congregation, but by the early 2000s, the children and grandchildren had moved away. Other churches were built, and Phillips Chapel lost congregants. Here is how it looked in 2009, almost 100 years old. It was deteriorating badly. There was no regular minister. Few members and Mr. Fielder were paying all the bills to keep it going. I want to talk about Mr. Fielder's life. He was educated in the segregated schools for black children in Las Cruces, graduated from the new, in 1934, Booker T. Washington School. He received his BA from New Mexico A&M College, now NMSU. During the Korean War, Mr. Fielder served as the first lieutenant in the newly integrated U.S. Army. He was given both the Purple Heart and the Silver Star for refusing to leave his fellow soldiers despite receiving serious wounds. After the war, he came back to Las Cruces to teach at Booker T. Washington, Court Junior High, and Alameda Elementary and Junior High schools. He also earned an MA from NMSU and was instrumental in creating the Black Studies program, which was taught in the history department from 1970 to 2005. Mr. Fielder had a long lifetime of teaching. Over 3 generations of students benefited by his presence in their lives. He served on the school board, Doña Ana County Historical Society, and New Mexico Cultural Properties Review Committee, and won many awards from the state for his accomplishments in education, history, and preservation. He led the restoration efforts at the chapel from 2009 to 2014. This is where we started in 2009. Note the spalling on the walls. There were many structural flaws and rampant decay. The use of Portland cement to protect the building did not do the job and was one of the worst things you can do to adobe. The cracks, tagging, and broken windows were just what we could see on the surface. By luck or divine providence, a former student of mine, Ron Taylor, who became the head of construction technologies at Doña Ana Community College, offered the first adobe restoration class and chose Phillips Chapel as its work site. When some of the concrete came off, adobe bricks had rotted and decomposed at the base of the south wall and in several places. Again, we were blessed from above. Mr. Pat Taylor, the country's foremost adobe expert, was hired to teach the class at Phillips Chapel. He worked with Mr. Larry Lemon, a volunteer on the project who is an amazing yesero, or traditional plasterer. Mr. Lemon received a Historic Preservation Award from the New Mexico Office of Cultural Affairs. He stayed on the project until it was completed. The rest of the gang, and there were probably 200 more, they were either students during the 3 semesters the Adobe Restoration class was taught, or the many volunteers who during the next 3.5 years who kept it going to completion. Unfortunately, Doña Ana Community College Adobe Restoration class only lasted for 1.5 years and was canceled. I believe there is no Adobe Restoration class taught in any college university in the state. I could show hundreds of pictures of people who worked and helped the restoration, but we'd be here for hours, so I want to tell one story. We knew the doors on the front in 2009 were just cheap hollow core doors, not original to the chapel. When we finally found a picture of the original doors, circa 1940, we knew we needed to replicate them. The following day, we met a man named Watson McKinnon, who came to volunteer to help plaster. When Clarence asked what he did and where he was from, he said he was a carpenter from Yukon, Canada, living each winter in Cruces. Clarence showed him a picture of the original doors, and Watson told us the next winter he would bring down 100-year bridge timbers and make those doors. When Watson left to do some measuring, Clarence turned to me, said, "I think God sent him." And these are the doors that my husband and Watson made. The project received no federal, state, or city funding. We depended exclusively on the charity of individual donors. Many people contributed, including the musicians who helped raise money during events like Christmas concerts and Mother's Day during Preservation Month. Dr. Bobby Green, a friend of the Fielder family, gave many performances with our NMSU Gospel Choir, and the Muddy Hands of Blues Band, created by my musician husband, gave several concerts to help raise money. All the events were successful and kept the project going. Here's how the church looked when it was almost finished before a Christmas concert in 2012, when people packed the church while many stood in the street to listen. By 2014, the church was completely restored inside and out. Mr. Fielder had the opportunity to see what he called that glorious day when he walked into the completely restored Phillips Chapel. Thanks to the efforts of the community and the leadership of Mr. Fielder, the chapel became part of the Mesquite Historic District. Today it continues to function as a church. In 2016, we decided to purchase a National Register plaque for the front and have a celebration for the Fielder family and many, many past volunteers and friends. I give this talk to honor the memory of Mr. Fielder, who passed away in 2015 at the age of 87. He was an extraordinary man, teacher, and historian who made a lasting impact on all who knew him and continues to do so today. From my experience, this is how historic preservation gets done. As David Chavez said, when I go by Phillips Chapel, I don't see just the church, I see Mr. Fielder. So since 2015, we created a Clarence Fielder archive at the City of Las Cruces Museums. The Clarence Fielder wing of the History Department at Breland Hall at NMSU was dedicated just this past April. The Museum Archive and History Department continues to collect relevant archival material on African American history. If you would like to make a donation to the Clarence Fielder Memorial Scholarship created last year, you can go to the website of the Community Foundation of Southern New Mexico. These scholarships are available to students attending colleges and universities in New Mexico. And Beth thanks you.
All right. Thank you again very much, Carl, for presenting that on behalf of Beth. Our next presentation is going to be a combination of two speakers. They represent the African American Museum and Cultural Center of New Mexico. This is Rita Paldrell and Maya Shamshabin. Choose the arrow right there to progress.
Does it go backward and forward, or?
Yeah, forward and back, just with two side arrows.
Okay. I will try to figure out how to do this.
So I am Rita Pardrell, and I am currently the director of the African Museum and Cultural Center of New Mexico. And thank you very much for inviting us to speak today. Actually, Clarence Fielder and Terry Moody have dedicated and given us a lot of the history that we present with the African American Museum and Cultural Center. But today, we're going to be looking at, let me see if I can get myself comfortable here. New Mexico's African American legacy. That worked okay.
Does that feel okay?
Yeah. So we'll be looking at New Mexico's African American legacy, visible, vital, and valuable. And we're going to be looking at it through the lens of an exhibit we have going on right now called Facing the Rising Sun. And it's the journey of African Americans, homesteaders in New Mexico. And it deals with their vision, their belief, and the importance of sovereign ownership of land. So going at it from a historical perspective and going back to vision of African Americans in this country, if we look at 1865, when General Sherman met with the Secretary of War, Stanton, and he invited 20 African American ministers to sit with them and did something unusual. He asked what African Americans wanted to do with this newfound freedom. And the minister said, the way that we can best take care of ourselves is to have land. So we can turn it, we can till it, and we can maintain ourselves. And by doing this, we will have more than enough to share. And that became, it was probably a vision all along, but it became the stated vision. And Sherman goes along, and he, in 1865, in January of 1865, he takes the 400,000 acres that were confiscated from the Confederates, and he turns it into 40-acre parcels, which he distributes to 40,000 approximately African Americans, according to Dr. Henry Louis Gates, and for them to till. And he also, and he makes this a special field order number 15, and also in that special field order, he states that no Anglos are to go onto this settlement, that is strictly for African Americans, and that the only Anglos that can be there are the military, and that's just for protection. So this happens in January 1865, and in the September of the same year, when President Andrew Johnson came into power, he rescinds that order. He takes back the 400,000 acres of land, and he redistributes it to the original plantation owners. Okay. But there was still belief, that the Civil War was ending, civil rights legislation was happening, so there was still belief that equality may be in the cards. But unfortunately, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and that Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination in public places. So on public transportation, in restaurants, it had schools and the jury in there, but in order to get it passed, they had to remove that. So it was just public accommodations. But the South and the North were pushing against having African Americans in other spaces. And so by 1883, after a lot of challenges, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is repealed. And when it is repealed, with a vengeance, the South starts to institute Jim Crow laws. And all the Jim Crow laws was restriction of movement, restriction of the freedom of movement, and that restriction was not just in the South, it was throughout the United States, and it was also in the North. So this caused the Ku Klux Klan and the Red Shirts, which were terrorist organizations, they were used to force African Americans into this new developed second-class citizenship. And it started the migration, and there were two great migrations, the one after the Civil War and the one after World War I, when a lot of the African Americans who went into the military were subject to lynching and things like that while in uniform. So this is what is the trigger for migration. And migration goes to the north and to the west. But the west was important because it was a territory. So there was a belief and a hope that the oppression that was faced in the south and then in the north would not be present in the west. So some of the first people who migrated to the west were the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the 24th Infantry of the Buffalo Soldiers. So they came west, and they were here to protect the homesteaders, the Anglo homesteaders, but they also protected the homesteads, the lands of indigenous people, and they also did engineering work, and they also found out about homesteading. So John Collins, who was a Buffalo soldier, would homestead 160 acres outside of the village of Albuquerque. The other migration that happened was made possible through the railroad, because the railroad was able to transport people to other places in the country. So the railroad was used by African Americans moving west to get west, but the railroad was also a means of income. So the railroad was hiring people, and it was hiring specifically African Americans because African Americans had pretty much built the railroad in the South, and they needed that labor. So they were advertising in the South, and people were in sharecropping and these dead-end jobs and facing this oppression. So the railroad looked like a good way to get out. But they also advertised extensively in the North because it was supposed to be the Mecca, and a lot of African Americans had migrated there. But when they got there, they found again that their movements were restricted, not free, and that their job ceiling was limited to basically service and domestic work. So the railroad brought people to the west, and it brought people to Albuquerque, Las Cruces, Raton, all through the west. And as African Americans worked on the railroad, they also settled here. And if they didn't know about the Homestead Act, they found out about the Homestead Act and the ability, if not through the Homestead Act, also to buy land rather cheaply. The other way, the mining industry, people don't think of that, but the coal industry brought African Americans to the state and to parts of the state that people don't think of African Americans as living. So like Dawson, New Mexico, and Raton, New Mexico, and again in Albuquerque and Grants and other cities. And again, these settlers decided to stay. And again, one of the things that caused them to stay was the ability to homestead. And then you had all the normal reasons why people migrated west, and with all ethnicities. So as people started settling in the west, one of the things that you needed was churches, which meant ministers would come. And also in the West, we were one of the states that was recommended for people with tuberculosis. So Dr. James Lewis, who was the second physician in Albuquerque, migrates to the village of Albuquerque in about 1918. And one of the first things he does is he homesteads. So he homesteads, and then you had the people that were actually fleeing oppression, like Baz Smalding and his family, and they go up to Clayton, New Mexico, and homestead 160 acres of land. So while African Americans are coming, they are also homesteading, and they are forming communities around these homesteads. And of course, the one that we hear quite a bit about is the visionaries. And the visionaries were Ella and Frank Boyer. They were visionaries, and they envisioned an independent black town, and they migrated to a place outside of Roswell. And they lived in Roswell and Lake Arthur and Dexter, and then they homesteaded in an area that Frank Boyer would name Blackdom, and they homesteaded 160 acres, and again, started community, had churches and grocery stores and schools. So the homesteading and that ownership of land was also bringing in community. So, what was the Homestead Act? So the Homestead Act of 1862 was signed by President Lincoln. He was able to pass it because the southern states had seceded, and that allowed him to pass the Homestead Act. It went into effect in 1863, and it allowed for the 160 acres, the claiming of 160 acres of public land, as long as you were an adult citizen, 21 years of age, or the head of household, you hadn't taken up arms against the United States, you agreed to work and improve or cultivate the land over a 5-year period, including the building of a house. And for the payment of a small amount of money, which was generally $18, you could lay claim to a homestead. African Americans used this Homestead Act, but there were also several others that African Americans used. You had the Desert Land Act, which Ella Boyer, the wife of Frank Boyer, who was one of the settlers in Blackdom, she utilized that Homestead Act, which allowed for you to homestead up to 640 acres, and it is still in existence. That Homestead Act was never repealed. The bad thing about that one is you had to irrigate your land, and Ella Boyer, from the record, spent over $1,200 trying to irrigate the land. The other Homestead Acts that African Americans used was the Homestead Act of 1909, which was the enlarged Homestead Act that allowed you to have 320 acres of land. And then there was the Homestead Act of 1916, which increased the amount of land you could have to 640 acres. So, let me see it. So, it looked like a good deal, homesteading. But you have to remember, when you made the homestead entry, you had a total of 7 years to complete the entire process to get a patent for your land. In other words, you didn't own the land, you just applied for entry to the land. And so your African American homesteaders, if you can imagine what 640 acres looks like, or 160 acres of land, semi-arid country. So here they were going to, first of all, they needed capital, because you're going to have to fence it, you're going to have to build a home, you're going to have to figure out water, and that takes capital. So African Americans fleeing from these different things had to figure out how to have the capital to make the improvements required within the period of time given to them. And the way they did this for a lot of people was the men worked. So the men in Blackdom, they would work in Roswell or Lake Arthur. In Las Cruces, the men would work in Las Cruces, and they would use the skills they had. So you had farmers that homesteaded, African American farmers, and they would become, they would work on farms in Las Cruces during the day. And so they would work 8 to 10 hours, 5 to 6 days a week. And then usually by wagon train, they would go to the homestead. The homesteads were required to be outside of the city limits. They would go to the homesteads and try to do what was required by law. Now, who was living on these homesteads while they were off working 8 to 10 hours? The women and children. And these were not pleasant places to live on. I mean, there's no home built yet. Sometimes they lived in tents. There's no water. We're talking the early 1900s. There's no water. There's no electricity. The houses are being built or they're makeshift, so you're having to put paper and stuff to keep out, you know, the wind and the dust. And then how do you cook? And then you're hauling water because most of them don't have wells. So living on those homesteads for the women and children was quite difficult. And a lot of times the men would also have lodgings elsewhere in the city. You know, so they would have two lodgings. They'd have the lodging in the city, and then they would go out on the homestead, and usually would work on the homesteads on the weekend with their family. And the interesting thing, let me see. The interesting thing about the homestead lands is families came. So it wasn't just the husband, and you know, it was children. So when you had Blackton, Ella Boyer, and Frank Boyer came with a bunch, you know, 11 kids, some of whom were adults, and those adults homesteaded. So you had a lot of homesteading going on within family members. So if you were able to do these things, you had your homestead entry that you had to fill out saying that you met the basic requirements to get a homestead. And if you had managed in the 5 years to build the house and cultivate the land and everything, then you had to give notice that you were doing proof. I'm going to prove that I'm entitled to this homestead. And once you gave that notice, you had to have witnesses. And generally you had to have 4 witnesses were listed. 2 witnesses had to swear that you had met the requirements. And you had to publish. So you had to go through your land agent or your register, and you had to indicate that you were getting ready to lay claim to this homestead, and they would post it. And then you had to put it in a publication in the area where you were homesteading, and it had to run for 5 weeks. Why? Because somebody might say that you're not entitled to that homestead, or they might have reason to tell the land agent that they didn't think you lived on it for 5 years or whatever. And so it had to run that length of time. Now, if all of that came out all right, then you would do your final entry, your final proof of homestead, and in that final proof, you would swear that you had met all the requirements. You had to list how you cultivated the land, you know, what you raised, how much land you cultivated, where the house was, and you had to give an evaluation of how much improvement you had made monetarily. And you had to have 2 witnesses also swear to that. If you passed that hurdle, and it was a hurdle, especially for African Americans, because you had land agents and they were powerful. And so they could come out and say, nope, I know you said you spent $1,500 on improvements, but you didn't. You only spent $600.
Were the land agents the government?
Huh?
Were the land agents from the government?
For the land?
The land agents you're talking about, did they work for the U.S.?
The land agents worked for eventually the Department of Interior.
Okay.
Yeah, so you had your local land agent, you had your local land office that was near your homestead. So like if you homesteaded outside of Las Cruces became your land office. In Albuquerque, it was Santa Fe. For the Blackton residents, it was Roswell. So you had a register at your local land office that all paperwork went through. And then you had the agents that they would send to the homestead to make sure that they would interview your neighbors. You know, did this person live on the land, you know, for the 5 years? And did they make the improvements? But like I was saying, if someone said, I did 1,500 in improvements, the land agent would go out and do his own evaluation. And you had to make improvements the equivalent of $1.25 an acre. So like if you homesteaded 640 acres, you should have spent $800 in improvements, and then you had to list it. And so someone could say, I spent $1,200, and the land agent could reevaluate it and say, no, I'm going to drop that to $475. So you haven't improved. So you're not entitled, and I'm going to do, and what they did was what's called an adverse action against the homesteader. And then that homesteader can either, I think they gave them 6 months to make up the difference, and that was a lot of money back then, or they could give up the claim, or say in the instance of 640 acres, they could reduce the claim. But if they manage to get back through the land agent, then eventually this is what they get. And that would be their patent to the land, which would be signed by the President of the United States or their representative. And once they got the patent, now the land was theirs. And then you started to see the churches, the social organizations around land ownership. So the grocery stores, the boarding houses, the cemeteries. We have a lot of African American cemeteries. And one of the reasons that this is an African American newspaper, the Southwest Review, and it came about, this article was protesting New Mexico moving to Jim Crow. Because a lot of the homesteaders, when they came here, it was with the hope that New Mexico would not suffer the oppression. They would not suffer the oppression they had in the South. And so in 1925, all of a sudden, New Mexico was instituting Jim Crow laws. And so this newspaper was one of the African American newspapers that published an article against doing that. The other thing that segregation did was it also brought homesteaders. So Beth's presentation was talking about Clarabelle Williams. Well, Clarabelle Williams and her husband Jasper were educators, and they came to Las Cruces to teach in those segregated schools. That's what brought them there, in addition to the oppression they were suffering in Texas. And when they got there, her husband Jasper homesteaded 640 acres of land. And he also became a civil rights advocate for the African American homesteaders outside of Las Cruces, of which there were about 40, and each had 640 acres of land. So just that group of homesteaders had about 25,000 acres of homestead land. Now, once the homesteaders got their patent, they may or may not have had the vision that the country had for them. So, so Dr. Lewis, his vision for the homestead was that he was going to plat it, and he was going to make it land that was available for the development of African American houses, so that African Americans could have affordable housing in the city of Albuquerque. And that vision was finally brought about by Virginia Ballou. And the East End Edition, which where she built 22 houses, was built on James Lewis's original homestead. So that was his vision. You had the Pettises, whose vision was an independent water utility company, and they plotted 100-acre lots and had 300 people buy those lots and supplied water to them down in Las Cruces. And Jasper Williams, with his 640, wanted to do a national Negro hospital, which never came about. So the common thing of land ownership being what developed communities and what cultivated communities and visions of communities was very prevalent in New Mexico. And the other cultivation, which I didn't speak to, is that all these homestead lands were required to be cultivated. So there had to be products. There had to be agriculture. And African Americans coming into the state and homesteading brought with them their agricultural expertise and their crops, and how they survived, how they developed these crops then, and how that comes into the present day is what Maya is getting ready to speak to.
Hello, so I'm Maya Shamsuddin. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Biology here at UNM. And like Rita said, I'm going to talk to you about the agriculture portion of this. How did these people make a home, a sense of place? And I'm going to concentrate on a particular case study of Blackton, New Mexico. And Blackton was an all-black farming town in southeastern New Mexico. And their intention from the outset was to have an agriculture-based society. And this is really difficult given the climactic regimes of that portion of the New Mexico territory. And the whole purpose of doing this was to create that sense of place, an empowered space for their children to grow up. And in addition to the agriculture being a very intensive portion of their design, they also had the intention of having education all the way through college. And it's important that when we have these discussions about erasure, we're telling history, that we don't contribute to the erasure of other peoples. And Blackton is going to be situated on Mescalero Apache land. And the Homestead Act played a very important role in the removal of indigenous peoples from their homelands. So the Mescalero Apache, in particular, their reservation was established in 1873, and the map inset here shows you Blackton in relationship to those homelands. Now, the Homestead Act in particular has been advertised as free public lands, but these lands were not free. Right? They came at the detriment of another population of people. And ultimately, they resulted in the settlement of 270 acres. To kind of contextualize Blackton, it's about 13,000 acres from our estimates. And when people were coming and accessing these lands, it was quite a difference. It was quite a transition. So oftentimes, these were not people who were living already in the Southwest. They were coming from places like Georgia, or they were coming from Texas, and they were encountering an environment that was really arid. The soil type was incredibly different. And so the smaller picture that we have here is what Blackton residents likely saw when they came to the area that we call Blackton. So they had a domination of black gramma grass, or Bouteloua eriopota, and then our soap tree yuccas, or yucca elata. And so this is going to pose a challenge, especially if you're trying to cultivate community and you're trying to meet those requirements of the Homestead Act that we just discussed. And then the other picture is just a current picture from the historical marker site. And so to combat this challenge of aridity, and then you also have this other intersection of capital, right? So Rita talked about that you're going to need to have the financial capacity to pay for fences, your home, etc. So oftentimes, for the majority of Blackton residents, with the exception of Ella Boyer, they couldn't afford to dig wells, they couldn't afford to irrigate their land, and so what can you do? You can take advantage of the free resources that we have. That's precipitation. One way to do that is through dryland farming. And so in areas of really high aridity, you typically see this practice when there's some kind of wet season. And so that could be winter, that could be fall. I'll talk a little bit about how it manifests here in New Mexico. But for Blackdom residents, another natural resource that you could potentially capitalize is surface water. They didn't have any. Or you could talk about the rivers, but they're going to be too far from the Pecos in order to successfully truck water in a meaningful capacity to really have an agriculture-based society where you can cultivate a large amount of crops. That's not really going to be feasible for Blackdom farmers to use. So instead, they use rainfall. And so in New Mexico, we tend to have a summer monsoon, and that's really rooted in the fact that we have a different heat capacity for your land versus your oceans. So what happens is the land is going to heat up faster relative to the ocean, and then you're going to have low pressure above your land surface. And so your wind, your air is going to travel from that high pressure area over the ocean to the area of low pressure. As that happens, your water is going to condense and you're going to get rainfall. And so Blackdom residents are going to be reliant on this pattern, and we're still reliant on this today in order to have that influx of water for their crops during the summer. But luckily in their area, they also have some snowpack, or they have some snow regimes down there sometimes, so then they can have some soil moisture that's stored in the winter too. Just depends. So given this, and so this is adapted from Wiseman. You've probably seen this graph. I just pulled the climate data from Prison Climate Group. And so here at 16 inches, that's that blue dashed line. That's what you need to dryland farm in this region. This is excluding our indigenous communities because lots of the indigenous peoples can farm well below the 16 inches and do it successfully. So what we're looking at here is on the x-axis, you have the year. On the Y, you're going to have your precipitation in inches. And so the overwhelming pattern is that often Blackdom residents did not have enough water to farm. They should not have been able to cultivate crops given the precipitation levels during the existence of Blackdom. And so we talked about using a natural resource, but they're kind of doomed here from the beginning, but they still were able to cultivate crops. And so that in itself, given we're only talking about water in this presentation because I don't have time for the other stuff, is pretty impressive. And so one of the most cultivated crops in Blackdom is sorghum bicolor. And this species in particular was first cultivated in Africa. That's where it was domesticated. And it has a long history in the African diaspora of being an important crop. So it was introduced to the Americas by enslaved African people, and it's been grown in subsistence plots and been crucial for the survival throughout the African diaspora in the Americas. And so sorghum bicolor is an excellent choice for this region in New Mexico because it's very well adapted to drought. So it has natural properties that allows it to cope with low rainfall conditions and less water. And we see 4 different records of different cultivars that were grown of this particular species in Blackdom. And one I do want to highlight is Federite. So that cultivar of sorghum bicolor is super crucial throughout the Western early 19th century American history because this cultivar in particular has super high productivity under limited rainfall. And so it's a great insurance if you have a drought year to pick this particular cultivar because you can still have great crops even if you don't have a lot of water. And then those are just some of the things that you can use sorghum for. The other thing that they farmed a lot of was alfalfa. Now, alfalfa is an interesting crop, and as many of us here who are from New Mexico, a part of this community, how we farm our alfalfa versus what alfalfa needs are 2 different things. And so I'm going to talk about the properties of alfalfa that make it suitable for dryland conditions, not how we currently farm it in New Mexico. So alfalfa is a super important crop even today, but even so during this time period. And it's super crucial to our food system because we have our cows that are then dependent on our alfalfa, and there's a whole system there. But alfalfa also has some great drought adaptations too. It's a deep-rooted perennial, so you don't have to plant it every year. And then it can also do very well in well-drained soil, which is helpful if you're doing things like a drip irrigation system. And so alfalfa was also an excellent choice for Blackton residents, given its properties and its economic return too. And then another thing that's important about creating this space is, yes, you need to have your economic resources, but you also need sites of community building. You also need sites like churches or organizations. And so another thing that we see in Blackton is they had a lot of small fruit trees. And these small fruit trees, I'm not sure if they were planted from seed or if they were potentially purchased, but if they were planted from seeds, you can look at a 2 to 3 year return before you actually get fruit. And so that is going to be a long time before you actually have the fruit production occur. And so they had apples, plums, and peaches in Blackton, in addition to their own gardens. And so these were typically by family on their homesteads, and so they grew things in much smaller quantity. This is things like corn, cantaloupe, onions, watermelon, and sugar beets, and then lettuce there in the background. And so typically these are not going to be your crops. They require too much water in order for them to be large scale. They're for the nourishment of the families. And we do have records of them sharing when they have a very successful crop of these plants, sharing with their neighbors. And so Blackton, really at its height, is going to have a post office, it has a store, it has a church, and estimates vary, but about 300 residents. And so although they were faced with a lot of challenges when it came to the climate, and many of the people did have to actually go to Roswell to find work, you have crop failures that coincide with those major dips in our graph that we saw. But the other thing that's really cool about Blackton is that they actually had 2 representatives that went to an entire Congress of Black farmers as the representatives from New Mexico. But unfortunately, this is a bit askew from the different versions. So this should be here in like this low orange dot, that's where the highlight should be. So in that particular drought year, that is going to be almost the nail in the coffin, so to say, for Blackton residents. There was not enough soil moisture. All of the crops failed during this year. And even though you had crop failures for certain farmers here, like in 1910, and the other dips, here it's affecting everyone in the community. And so the drought of 1916, 1912, 1917 is going to really cause people to start to leave Blackton because the crops fail. And you have some other things that are also occurring during this time in the community. And so ultimately, about 1928, Blackton will be abandoned and it'll be no more. But one thing that's really evident in this story when we think about history and thinking about our present, about what New Mexico farmers are discussing now, what we will face under climate change, is this idea of water and how important water is. So Blackton residents, to combat that 1917 drought, could have potentially tried to look for other sources of water. So at the time, like in the late 1860s through our current time point, artesian wells were not discovered, but the aquifer was discovered. And so you had an agriculture boom that was occurring in Roswell and the surrounding areas, but that drilling is expensive. And Blackton residents didn't really have the capital to do that. In addition, because there was such an agricultural boom, you actually had the water table drop. And so they didn't allow people to continue building wells. And so there was actually a ban, and so that pretty much really shrunk the opportunities for getting water for Blackton residents. And so with that, that is how they built their community. That's how agriculture plays into this larger narrative. And I thank you for being here. And both groups will take questions. Yes, okay.
I didn't see you. Okay, we have a break on the schedule now. We will come back for a session from the HPD folks. We'll come back at 2:25. There's no questions. I'm like,
Me too. I was just waiting for it to start.
same. Every single time I saw their finger go. No, I did it. All right, I gotta do this now.
We're good, right? Now it's
Yeah, Carla gave me some new files to swap out for theirs, so I need to make sure that's gonna be good.